This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by AASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. At the time of recording, there's just over a month left to submit abstracts for the AASA Conference 2023, which has the theme of animal cultures. The conference will be held in Sydney, Australia in November 2023. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press, and it's a great collection of books about animal studies. The most recently published volume in the series is the collection Decolonising Animals, edited by Rick DeVos, which addresses a topic which I know is of interest to lots of listeners. If you're writing about, thinking about, teaching about, or just interested in decolonisation, I do encourage you to get hold of a copy. Unlike lots of academic books, it's actually very accessibly priced. And also a quick shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updated theme tune for Knowing Animals. To learn more about Elizabeth, visit veganthused.com. Now today I'm very pleased to introduce you to Brian Kateman. Brian is an adjunct professor in environmental science and sustainability at Kean University in New Jersey, and he also teaches at Fordham University in New York. But he's probably better known for his journalism and his activism. He's the founder of the Reducetarian Foundation and the author of several popular books on food and food systems. Today, we're going to talk about his 2022 book, Meet Me Halfway, How Changing the Way We Eat Can Improve Our Lives and Save Our Planet, published by Prometheus Books, and his 2021 documentary, which was also called Meet Me Halfway. Welcome to the podcast, Brian.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on.
So can you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
Yeah, like most responses to these sorts of questions, it starts with my childhood. I grew up in Staten Island, New York, which is, if you're familiar with New York City, Staten Island is not known to be a particularly progressive place. It's not a plant-based mecca by any means. But one part of Staten Island I really did like growing up in was the nature. There's this thought of as the green borough. There's a lot of green spaces. And I always liked animals, being with animals in the wild. I was fascinated by the squirrels and the birds and so on. And so by the time I got to college, I was already identifying as an environmentalist. I cared a lot about our planet. And I did the things environmentalists do. I recycled and I walked instead of drive and so on. And at some point, a friend actually gave me a book, The Ethics of What We Eat by Peter Singer and Jim Mason. And that was really the first time I started thinking about food. I just didn't know that our food choices mattered as much as they did in terms of our impact on the planet, biodiversity loss, water usage, climate change, so on. And even thinking more holistically about our relationship to farmed animals in terms of their welfare and human health. And so I kind of did the sensible thing, which was go vegetarian on my way to being fully vegan. And that worked out for the most part, but there were times where I sort of fell off the tofu train, as they say. I was at a Thanksgiving, for example, and I had a small piece of turkey, and I got a little flack from my sister, who knew I had identified as a plant-based eater, but had eaten some turkey. And I had a couple instances like that. And slowly, and we can get more into this, I recognized that my own commitment was around trying to do the best that I could while knowing I was flawed. And that maybe the vegetarian vegan label didn't work for me. And perhaps more importantly, as I was trying to spread this message just in my own little community, my own little world, I realized that most people I knew were never going to be vegetarian or vegan, and they were never going to be a flexitarian. They weren't going to be like me. They weren't going to have mostly plant-based meals. It just wasn't going to happen. But maybe they could be inspired to cut back on the amount of animal products that they consume. And that really was the start of what has been the sort of better part of my last decade, founding the Reducetarian Foundation and really trying my best to create a world in which people reduce the amount of animal products that they consume.
So I think it's fair to say that Meet Me Halfway is a book that's very much in the tradition of, say, Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma, and that this is quite a crowded market in terms of pop books exploring the food system and questioning our eating of meat. So what is it that makes Meet Me Halfway distinct in that market?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in some ways, it's not distinct. In some ways, it's complementary to all of these other books that have existed and have, impacted my own thinking. I think the one thing that is very unique about the book is that it's very personal. A lot of people resonate, I think, with the Reducitarian movement and with me in my just relatability and honesty about what it's like growing up in the family that I had and what it's like being a person who wants to live ethically but sometimes falls short of that. There's I think, a radical honesty to the work that I do, and I think that is reflective in Meet Me Halfway, the book. I also take a very pragmatic approach to everything that I do. So I have my own ideals around what I'd like the world to look like. But at the end of the day, I have trouble thinking of a system that causes more suffering than factory farming. And all of the work that I do is really centered around ending that. And I like that Meet Me Halfway, along with the other work that I do, is looking at solutions that, while all are imperfect, are not factory farming. And that framing, I think, is actually quite unique compared to some of the other pieces of rhetoric that are out there.
I actually thought your book and documentary were very highly sympathetic to veganism. But I think that you and your Reducetarian Foundation sometimes seem somewhat hostile to veganism, or at least you're presented as somewhat hostile to veganism. So let me ask you directly, in what ways, if at all, are you critical of veganism?
Well, first we have to understand what those two words mean. I know what reducitarian means probably better than vegan, right? Because I coined the term. So a reducitarian is someone who's cut back on the amount of animal products that they consume. And because it's an umbrella term, it includes vegans, at least as I interpret vegan to mean, because vegans have reduced their consumption of animal products. It's just that they've done so effectively that they eat none at all. So it's important to recognize that vegan is a part of Reducitarian. That said, I want there to be more vegans in the world. I would like people to reduce the amount of animal products that they consume such that they're not eating any at all. Because my goal is to reduce societal consumption of animal products. And the more people who are vegan, the more that goal is going to be accomplished. That said, I do think it is unrealistic to expect most people to go vegan. And I also think there's a lot we could tease out here about the word vegan, in that I think people treat it like it's a very serious word, whereas I think it has the same seriousness as reducitarian. And by that I mean, I think it is a very clever marketing term. And I think where I get sort of caught up is when people treat it like it's a very serious term. But I just want to clarify that I'm definitely supportive of more people being vegan. But I think it's foolish to think most people will be vegan. I think it's extremely foolish. And it irks me to live in a world in which people do not see humanity the way I see it, which is that most people are not going to be able to go vegan.
So is that because of concerns about the structure? That is, it's just not feasible for many people to be vegan? Is that concerns about motivation?
All of it. I mean, it's just really, really hard to not eat meat. I can watch a factory farming video in which I'm crying, and then I'll see an ad 1 minute later for bacon, and I'll start to salivate. Now, that's my truth. That's my reality, right? People don't like when I say that, but that is my experience. And I have a lot of sympathy for omnivores who go through that experience. There are many people who don't want animals to be tortured, but they can't override the experience that they have where they want to eat them. And I have a lot of sympathy for that experience. But I also think, and I think this gets at part of the heart of my critique of the word vegan, humanity is not very good. And I think there's a power in acknowledging that. And sometimes I worry that people who identify as vegan underestimate all the ways in which they either directly harm animals or they ignore the suffering of animals. And I worry about living in a world in which people think that they're good stewards of the planet. And I mean this in a very sort of intellectual academic sense, because I'm a marketing guy. So I want people, average everyday people, to think that they're good people for cutting back on the amount of animal products that they're consuming. If they're eating an average of 200 pounds of meat a year and they cut back and now they're eating 180 pounds, I want them to feel good about that, because I think feeling good is what leads people to make changes rather than feeling shamed. But when you and I are having an honest, off-the-cuff conversation, I'm deeply disturbed by thinking that we can create a world in which most people are actually deeply concerned about the sentience of non-humans. And I'm concerned about that for consequentialist reasons. And if I'm being honest, I'm also just irked at it because I find it so absurd.
I'm actually very sympathetic to a lot of what you say. I'm inclined to think very personally, and kind of drawing upon my own work in political theory and political philosophy and politics, that part of the problem is framing veganism as this very individual level solution. Are you a vegan? What are you doing right here, right now? I think, and maybe this is quite utopian from me, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. So what we need to do is change the incentive structures. So you're absolutely right that you say, well, we can show someone a video of factory farming, but then if they see an advert a few minutes later, they're going to start salivating. But what if there weren't these adverts, right? What if we were to change our environment such that it wasn't so much a case of people choosing to go vegan, but that just became the default choice?
I agree with you on that. I really think that that was a lesson for me. You know, I came at this in my early 20s a little bit arrogant. I thought telling people to go vegan is really silly. And I still think it's really silly for the most part. But it turns out telling people to eat less meat is pretty silly too. I think it's less silly, but I still think it's silly. Most people probably are not going to listen to me, no matter how hard I try. It's just too hard to make that change, and people are on average not very good. By good, I mean they're not going to be able to override their selfish interests, which is they want to be happy, they want to be joyful, they want to eat the foods they love, they want to reflect on the baseball game that they went to when they were a kid with their dad and had the hot dog. I mean, I'm not blaming individual people. It's an evolutionary problem. We have inherited this body and this, cognitive architecture that just makes it really hard to live a moral existence, especially when it's not in relation to humans. And so I think having alternatives on the market that make it easier is certainly part of that, and working on policy efforts and finding sympathetic politicians and so on is an essential part of it. And I'm also not opposed to people trying to get others to care about animals. But I want us to hold in the back of our mind that it's really difficult to do that. It's really, really hard. And I'd like us to try to think pragmatically from a consequentialist perspective on how to actually make some positive changes. I also get very frustrated with corners of the vegan movement in that they're idealists. I don't know how else to describe it. I find that they're very fixated on this utopia. I mean, you use that word, this end state where everyone's happy and there's no animals being killed and slaughtered and we're all morally evolved people. And it feels like one step further from a Disney movie to me. It's just so divorced from our reality, the present moment. I'm much more concerned about making the world very bad compared to extremely bad. My expectations are just much lower. And I want to just personally live in a world where I feel understood and people see the world for how bad it is. So when people are fixated on some sort of utopia, and even worse, debate each other around different kinds of utopia when we're so far from that space and we all have a lot that we agree on right now, it does really frustrate me. Now, I admit, maybe some of that frustration is misplaced. I should be more frustrated, and I think in my heart I am, at factory farms and all the omnivores who are eating too many animal products, and I do spend most of my work on that. But it is true, I'm human, I'm flawed, and occasionally I engage in horizontal hostility, as it's called, because we all do that when we have overlapping concerns social justice movements do this. But I do think that given there's a small number of people who care about this issue, I'd like them to try to work on making the world marginally better and not worry so much about making the world a great place.
I like what you say about the shared concern, but let me push back against that a little bit and drill down into one of the areas where it seems like your sympathies might diverge from the sympathies of lots of vegan listeners or animal activists. So in the documentary, I was really quite taken by Will Harris of White Oak Farms. And my impression of him, and this is something that some listeners won't really like, was positive, even if I might be quite hostile towards the things that he's doing, and perhaps even if his politics might be a bit alien to me as a Brit. But I think based on what you say in the book, you're actually more sympathetic to his position than I am.
Will Harris is an amazing person. He is I think, 5th generation farmer. So this farm has been in his family for many, many years. And I believe it was his grandfather that sort of industrialized it and turned it into not the idyllic farm that at least I imagine, but into a factory farm. And Will Harris decided after many years of running his farm in an industrial way that he wanted to turn back the clock and raise animals and in a way that were more compassionate and really focus on land stewardship and the revival of his community, creating opportunities for employment. And I visited his farm. Will is a very charismatic person. He's very straightforward. He tells it like it is, but he's also nice and he's extremely smart. And he showed me around his farm, and it's not a factory farm. The animals were very happy. They were roaming around on the grass. They weren't mutilated. They weren't castrated. They weren't branded. They weren't in cages. They were eating grass, the ones that were ruminant animals. They don't even have to travel very far to go to the slaughterhouse like most factory farmed animals do. They walk to the slaughterhouse. It's right on the property, so there's less stress involved. The animals have really good lives. There's no other way to put it. And they have a crappy last day. To me, these just seem like empirical facts so far, what I've said. So that's not factory farming, so I support it. That's the line in which I follow. If it's not the worst thing in the world, then I support it, because I'm not optimistic we'll even be able to create that. I think what will most likely happen is factory farms will continue to grow and people will continue to eat more meat. A world in which, gosh, I mean, I could tear reflecting on a world in which all animals were raised on a farm like Will's. That is a version of utopia. That would be amazing. Amazing. We're so far from that place. We're so far. So to anyone who opposes this kind of farming, and we can talk more about maybe differences that you and I have on this front, I go back to that original premise that it's just not worth spending time focusing on a higher welfare, maybe even regenerative farm, because they're nowhere near as bad, even if you think they're bad, as a factory farm.
I'm intrigued by this principle of, I think you said, if it's not the worst, you support it. Is that something that you hold in other areas of life as well? Do you think that about, for example, human rights abuses?
I support harm reduction. I try not to get caught up in what I would like. Try to focus on what's the maximum amount of good I can create, what's the least amount of suffering. I wrote an article recently for Vox that I want horse racing to be abolished. Now, it's not a word you often hear me use, right? I'm the Reducitarian guy. I've also written an article about animal testing for NBC. I want animal testing abolished. I use those words because I think that there's enough momentum and enough consensus where that world is actually possible. I think it's possible we could end the horse racing. I think it's possible we can end animal testing. People don't have the same relationship they do with horses and animal testing. Lots of people I know don't want to support that, even though, of course, there are some who do. But with other areas, that is not the case. That is not the case. It may not be that supporting the ideal is the most effective way of creating change. And I think that's why many people who support abolition across all sorts of injustices are the same kinds of people who support harm reduction. There's an honest inconsistency, but it's not actually inconsistent in a sense, because people are doing math in their head around what is possible and what it's not. So would it be great if there were no people addicted to drugs? Of course it would be great. But the folks in that community often are very hostile to people who are against harm reduction, who want to abolish the addiction of drugs and don't think we should offer clean needles to people. Right? I'm into plant-based meat. I love plant-based meat. I want more people to eat it. There are a lot of health advocates who are abolitionists in a different sense. They only believe people should be eating fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes. And they look at people who support plant-based meat as highly compromised and violating some ideal around getting people to be healthier. So all of us are playing this game, whether we realize it or not. I'm just honest about it. I'm just being transparent about the times in which I think it's possible and the times I think I don't. And again, I think this comes back to my concern around the vegan label. It makes people think that they're sort of always morally consistent in this kind of way. And I think every one of us is playing some sort of probabilistic game around how to make the world a better place. And we often are deeply flawed. And I really worry about a world in which people don't recognize that.
So it seems like a lot of this is an empirical question about whether favouring a reducitarian message or a firmer vegan message is going to be the one that actually leads to more suffering reduction. Now, of course, we could argue about whether suffering reduction is really the goal we're aiming for, but assuming it is, do you have empirical evidence that the reducitarian approach is the one that is more effective?
There's two ways to answer that question. There is a very microcosm here where we're talking about, I have a megaphone. What should I say? Should I tell people to eat less meat, or should I tell people to go vegan? And we did conduct a study with some researchers looking at this question. Folks can go to reducetarian.org/lab if they're interested in seeing the actual study, but it was published in a reputable journal. And basically, the design was such that some people received an intervention that they read in op-ed that was structured to emphasize eating less meat. Some received an intervention op-ed around cutting out all meat. And another read an article about exercise for a sort of control. And what the study found was, among a certain group of people, relatively well-educated, liberal, not super wealthy, and young, they were much more likely to cut back on the amount of animal products that they consumed in the long run, were more likely in the intervention around eating less meat versus telling people to go vegan. Now, that doesn't surprise me, obviously, because I founded this movement, and I think, to me, it's just intuitive. In my life, when someone says to do something all in, I just give up. I don't want to meditate every day. It's not happening. I don't want to exercise every day. But when someone gives me an out where I can do something a little bit, I can feel good about that, and I don't feel like I'm climbing this horribly intense mountain. So to me, this is just very intuitive. But I still think I just want to make sure we're on the same page here. There's a supplementary question, which is, do you believe that the world can go vegan? And that is a very different question. If someone wants to argue to me, oh, the world's never going to go vegan, but I just think I'll tell people to go vegan because that'll get them to eat less meat, I'm actually more sympathetic to that. I'm deeply disturbed by someone looking at the world around us and hangs out with my family in Staten Island and thinks the world is going vegan. I mean, we can't even get, some of the most basic moral advancements in society. To imagine a world in which we're not slaughtering animals feels very foreign to me. And I'm not convinced that telling people that they should go vegan or that's the world that we should have is particularly useful.
Yes, good. That's interesting. I suppose, there's two things I'd like to say here. And one is, we can argue about timeframes. I'm going to be the last person to say that the world will be vegan in a year. But in 50 years, in 100 years, in 200 years, if people are still here in 200 years, I think there is a non-negligible chance that the world will be approaching vegan. But that leads me to the second point, Towards the end of both your book and the documentary, you point towards cultivated meat, precision fermentation, plant-based meat, plant-based milk, plant-based eggs, and so on, as offering a great deal of promise. And it's my view that it's these kinds of technologies that offer the promise of genuinely animal-friendly food production in a way that the likes of White Oaks Farm just don't, because White Oaks Farm still involves the killing of animals. But I think perhaps you're more skeptical. Do you not think that there's a chance that these kinds of technologies, without the likes of White Oak Farm, offer us a genuinely humane future?
Well, I really like your question. And before I answer it, I just want to emphasize one major downside of technology, which is that it will not make people morally better in a sense. Because people are who they are. We are humans. And so we will make it potentially such that people can eat what they want for a price that's affordable whenever they want it. And that will allow people not to hurt animals. That's very different than someone attending a philosophy lecture and realizing that animals matter and we shouldn't eat them. Right?
I agree.
It's very different. So there's a real downside there. But of course, I'm very skeptical that we'll be able to get people to be more morally evolved in at least the ways that you and I would like, to the level extent we would like. I think that the most likely outcome is that factory farms will continue for a very, 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 very long time. And I think your description of 200 years from now strikes me as not in line with my thinking about the world. It feels very polar opposite my view of the world, and I want to name that. I think that we don't know how to end factory farming, which is why any reasonable pragmatic strategy should be on the table in trying to make that happen. So I'm very agnostic around what interventions to use. Sometimes I speak with people who think policy is a waste of time or food technology. To me, this all strikes me as very arrogant. We just don't know. We really don't know because it's a really hard problem. And so I support diversifying our efforts. I want different people from different backgrounds with different skill sets to work on what they're most excited about. But I also think every strategy is most likely to fail than succeed. And I don't think that means we shouldn't do it. We still have to do it because the amount of suffering or lack of happiness or whatever you care about is dramatic in these systems. And so we have no choice but to try, and I'm not going to ever give up. I'm going to keep doing this work. But I don't think we should be super optimistic about any of these interventions because I want to live in reality. And again, to me, it strikes me as very anti-reality. I also would go so far as to say it's almost a form of gaslighting advocates. I spend so much time with people who are sad about the state of the world, who they don't feel like they're making enough of a difference. I want to honor that. It's painful to care about this space and to describe this optimism when we're going in the opposite direction, to me, is deeply hurtful. And maybe that's where it goes from my intellect to my heart. I'm very excited about alternative proteins as an intervention insofar as I think we should pursue them. Do I think that they're likely to work? Probably not, because most things fail. It's very hard to make these things happen. Plant-based meat doesn't taste exactly like animal-based meat, and it's still expensive, and people are cognitively weird, and they want to eat animals, right? They want to eat meat. Precision fermentation is really cool. We can get egg proteins, we can get dairy proteins, and I think there's some promise there in cutting into demand. And cell culture meat is really exciting, but I am concerned that it's not going to be able to scale, much like I am high welfare regenerative meat, the type of stuff Will Harris is doing. And so what this comes back to is my view that most interventions will fail. We don't know which ones will succeed. Let's support them all because all of them are better than factory farming and all of them have their own pros and cons. Of course, it would be great if people could eat meat that doesn't come from slaughter. Or it would be great if people could eat meat if it came from plants, or it'd be great if people could eat meat from cells. And yes, there's all these different pros and cons to each of these, but all of them are better. So that's kind of my honest take on that. And I just want to emphasize that it's taken me a while to be so honest because it's very easy to be rah, give me money. This is going to work. Put the money into the VC, put the money into the nonprofit doing this particular kind of work. That's why you have some of this optimistic rhetoric. But I've just gone to a place where I'm going to live authentically and be honest, and may the chips fall where they may.
Now, Brian, we ask everybody who comes on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Let's do it.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
The easy one that comes to mind is Peter Singer's book, The Ethics of What We Eat, which is what I mentioned earlier. And that definitely had a major impact on me. I'd always been very sympathetic to utilitarianism before I knew there was a word for it. Friends would often ask me what I cared about, and I would say more smiles and less frowns. I used to say that all the time when I was younger, and I just didn't know there was a word to describe that. I was also very interested in evolutionary biology as a kid. My dad is a creationist, and by that I mainly mean that he thinks the world is 6,000 years old and believes the words in the Bible. Growing up, it was very important to believe in God, and it was very important to believe that God was good, but I didn't really have to do anything, which was very interesting. It was very focused on belief and faith, but we didn't have to do anything to honor that. It was just having the right thought, I suppose. And when I got to college, I learned about evolution for the first time. And that, because it never made sense to me what my dad was sharing with me. So when I learned about evolution, it really had a dramatic impact on me. And this is a long-winded way of saying Richard Dawkins was very influential on me. I read The Selfish Gene, and it wasn't the selfish part, although I've talked about humanity being selfish, but just understanding the very basics of natural selection and various mechanisms by which evolution takes place, and also drawing an understanding of how much similarity we have with other creatures and understanding the mechanisms by which we came to be. That certainly had a major impact on my concern for the well-being of non-humans.
Yes, Dawkins is a very interesting character, perhaps echoes of your own position, in that he's someone, I believe, who says that we should be vegan, but who isn't himself.
I should be vegan. I mean, I'm 98.652% vegan. But again, and this is the thing, I hate to, I don't want to be annoying, but I just want to make really clear that being vegan does not make a person all around a good person. It's one more obligation we might describe and be excited about, but I don't know if we should be all going for walks for fun and killing insects. I probably should call my mom more. I definitely should walk my dog more. I'm in many areas of my life, I am not perfect, and I meet a lot of people, and I know that they all have their struggles. So it's just important to recognize that there's a whole host of suffering that is beyond one's plate, and that's really the thing I just want to make really clear here. And I think wild animal suffering, dramatically more than factory farming on a scale that is inconceivable to the mind. And all of us who don't even think about it, or think about it but then ignore it, I think are failing morally in some ways. So I think I have a slightly more holistic picture of the amount of suffering that exists in this world.
Yes, and I should acknowledge, of course, that wild animal suffering is something we talk about on Knowing Animals quite a lot, and I'm hoping to feature more of that in the near future. So, can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
The first piece that comes to mind to me, and we can debate whether this counts as scholarship, but I'll count it for the purposes of the discussion. In 2015, so almost 8 years ago, I wrote a piece in Quartz, which is owned by The Atlantic. And the title of that piece, if I recall, was "We Need More Meat-Eating Animal Advocates," or maybe it was "Meat-Eating Animal Rights Advocates." I can't remember. And I love that title, and lots of people hate it.
Yes.
And I really love that title, and I really love that piece, and I share it often because it's really interesting to see, and I'm sure you feel this way about some of your work. Like, some thoughts you have over time change. But I read that piece recently, and I was like, wow, that's perfect. What a great distillation of the Reducitarian movement. We do need more people who eat meat to care about animals. We absolutely need that, and we will not make advances for animals if we do not include people who eat meat in that discussion. I'm no doubt that there's an opportunity to leverage the inconsistency that people hold, in which some people really do care about animals but engage in behaviors, or lack thereof, as I've described many times with vegans, that hurt animals either directly or indirectly.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
This one's pretty easy. It would definitely be Peter Singer for me. It's really fascinating to just have all these thoughts when you're young and feel alone and feel, I grew up in Staten Island. I was a really weird kid. I'm nothing like most of my family members. And when you learn that there's, a person who represents a large group of people who have a certain set of thinking, it's really profound how that can make a person feel loved and less alone and understood, and activate an advocacy in a person to make the world in line with that philosophy.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
It's a really fun question, and a couple thoughts come to mind. I'm really interested in practicality, and maybe this just reflects a bias in me that I'm mostly a practitioner. But as someone who, I teach 4 or so classes a semester, a lot of students, in my view, they're smart and they have good ideas, but they don't have the skills necessary to actually go out and do what they need to do to practically make the world better and align with those philosophies. So I'm very interested in education that's centered around teaching young people tangible skills that are useful, that are marketable. That's most of what I do and what I'm interested in. I also think it's just important for academics to hang out with people who are not on campus. I wish I could do daily tours to Staten Island. I really wish. I often talk to people and I want them, come to McDonald's. Come to McDonald's with me and say that. Go up to the cash register, go up to the people there. It often just feels disconnected. And it's not just academics. I often see articles written about being against alternative proteins like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, and they want people to eat carrots and broccoli. What are you talking about? These people are not going to eat these foods right now. It's not going to happen. And again, it comes back to this idealism. It would be wonderful if we could override our addiction to salt, sugar, and fat. It would be wonderful if we could see that burger as being a part of a cow. My dad says in the documentary version of Meet Me Halfway, I'm not concerned about the temperature of the planet. I'm concerned about the temperature of my house. And so I just feel as though sometimes we get a little caught up in our own minds around what we would like to be the world. And it's not. It doesn't reflect that in a lot of corners of the world.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
And I think this is a boring answer, but I would like us to be able to see them as individuals. And I mean that across the board, like a lot of people care about dogs and cats, and a lot of vegans care about pigs and chickens. But I sometimes use the analogy like, what if ants were sort of like small dogs? And then when a vegan invites me to go for a walk for fun, that changes my perspective a little. And I understand dogs are not ants. I get that. And I also understand that we don't know to the extent that ants have sentience. But I do get frustrated when even people who have thought deeply about these issues somehow stop, in expanding that moral circle. And I feel really strongly about it in the context of wild animal suffering. It really bums me out that there are a lot of people who think that just because an animal has some different historical relationship in where they are, that means that we don't have some obligation or some interest in helping them. And so I want people to recognize the interests of all individuals that have the capacity to suffer, and for us to think strategically about ways to help them.
What are you working on next?
It's a good question, and I really like it because I have a kind of unique answer, which is I'm not working as hard as I used to. I had a really intense, decade, it feels like to me. And I've almost burned out a couple times. I've had my moments and by moments I really mean like weeks or months where I'm pretty depressed about some issue. And it usually happens when I learn about something that I hadn't thought of before. The wild animal suffering one was rough. where I had not thought about that before. And that hit me really hard. I remember one winter in New York, and I was just thinking about all the animals in Central Park and just feeling really sad about how much suffering they must be going through and being just, cold, if nothing else. I had a similar feeling about something called long-termism. If folks are familiar in the effective altruism community, this actually gets at the heart of why I'm so scared of people thinking humanity is capable of being really good, because there's a subset of long-termists who really want us to colonize the universe and expand humanity. And I mean this, I think, seriously, that I have trouble thinking of a more dangerous idea. It really pales in comparison to ideas around that we might have about our relationship to animals. The idea that humans will be great in the future really scares me, because I think it's going to set us up to, in the short term, like go to the moon, go to Mars, and we'll have factory farms there, and we'll have new wild animal populations and so on. So I'm definitely not working as hard as I used to, but I'm still working. We have an annual conference coming up. We move from city to city. We have a fellowship program that I really like. I admit, I know this is maybe sobering or depressing framework for my talk, but the one place that does give me hope is young people. I'm increasingly attracted to this idea that old people die, young people are born, young people have new sets of ideas and frameworks, and which is why I think academics have a really exciting opportunity to try to cultivate an interest in ethics and animals and so on. We have a fellowship program where we work with undergraduate students. We have about 30 or so. Our second year is starting. And it's really amazing to see these young people from all different backgrounds care about this issue. And I'm increasingly excited about investing in education and youth. And truthfully, there'll be a point in the coming, months or years, where I commit to a new project. And by that, I mean like a new era of Meet Me Halfway. There'll be some new multi-year capstone that will probably involve another book and maybe another film and some kind of large-scale media work. But in the meantime, I'm really enjoying writing smaller pieces. I've been writing a lot of op-eds. I feel like it's like one every 2 weeks or so in some mainstream media outlet. And I'm really enjoying teaching. I know this is mostly academics who listen to this. Teaching has been so helpful for my emotional health. Being with young people, not just being in my own lost little mind, but actually talking to young people has been so enjoyable and transformative, and they teach me a lot.
How can people find out more about your work?
They can go to reducetarian.org, REDUCETARIAN. They can go to meetmehalfway.org, MEAT is the spelling. If they like silly, fun, hot takes, they can follow me on Twitter, where all absurdity lives. And they are welcome to come to our Reducitarian Summit in person and hang out with other people who transparently are willing to put aside their differences and focus on reducing consumption of animal products and ending factory farming.
Well, thanks, Brian, for joining us for this podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Please do spread the word about Knowing Animals. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.